I fixed my widowed neighbor's porch. She joked. If I were 20 years younger, I'd the sound of splintering wood echoed through the quiet neighborhood, just as the summer storm rolled in. Across the street, an old porch sagged dangerously under the weight of years of neglect. And for a terrifying second, I thought someone was standing on it. My heart jumped into my throat. Thankfully, no one was hurt. But that moment changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. Before we begin, if you believe kindness still matters, if you believe second chances can change lives, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that remind us of the good still left in the world. My name is Nathan Walker, and this happened in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. I was 38 years old, recently divorced, and trying to rebuild a life that felt like it had fallen apart. My marriage had ended after 12 difficult years. The house felt empty. The evenings felt longer than they should. Most days I buried myself in work just to avoid thinking about how lonely everything had become. Across the street lived a woman named Margaret Sullivan. She was 72 years old and had been widowed for nearly a decade. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, baked pies during the holidays, and somehow always knew when someone was having a hard day. Yet despite her warm smile, there was a sadness around her that never completely disappeared. Her husband, Thomas, had built their home with his own hands nearly 40 years earlier. After he passed away, Margaret stayed there alone. She often sat on her porch in the evenings, watching the sunset as if she were waiting for someone who would never return. The storm that afternoon revealed just how badly the porch had deteriorated. Several support boards had cracked, and part of the railing leaned dangerously outward. As I looked at it, I realized it wasn't just an eyesore, it was a hazard. The next morning, I walked across the street and offered to help. Margaret insisted she would manage somehow. She explained that she had already received estimates from contractors, but the prices were far beyond what she could afford. Living on a fixed income meant every dollar mattered. Something about the disappointment in her eyes stayed with me. Maybe it was because I understood what it felt like to carry burdens alone. Maybe it was because helping someone else seemed easier than fixing my own broken life. Whatever the reason, I told her not to worry. I would repair it myself. The surprise on her face was unforgettable. Over the following weeks, my evenings became dedicated to that porch. After work, I would change clothes, gather my tools, and head across the street. The summer air smelled of freshly cut grass and warm earth. Birds chirped from nearby trees, while the sun slowly dipped toward the horizon. Margaret would bring iced tea and sit nearby while I worked. At first, we barely talked, but gradually stories began to emerge. She told me about growing up in rural Kentucky. She spoke about meeting Thomas at a church picnic when she was just 19 years old. Her eyes would light up whenever she described their early years together. The struggles, the dreams, the tiny apartment where they started with almost nothing. I found myself looking forward to those conversations. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about my divorce every evening. Instead, I was listening to stories about resilience, sacrifice, and enduring love. One evening, as the golden sunlight filtered through the trees, Margaret watched me replacing a damaged support beam. She laughed softly and shook her head. She said that if she were 20 years younger, she would probably be trying to marry me. The comment caught me completely off guard. I laughed, and so did she. But beneath the humor was something deeper. It wasn't romance. It wasn't flirtation. It was gratitude. It was affection. It was the acknowledgement that human kindness still existed in a world that often felt cold and disconnected. For a brief moment, I noticed tears forming in her eyes before she quickly looked away. That was the day I realized how lonely she truly was. As summer continued, our friendship deepened. Neighbors began noticing the transformation of the porch. Fresh wood replaced rotten boards. New paint brightened the entire structure. Flowers appeared in planters along the railing. But something else was changing too. Margaret seemed happier. She spent more time outside. She smiled more often. She started attending neighborhood gatherings again after years of avoiding them. Meanwhile, I found my own wounds beginning to heal. There was something powerful about helping another person without expecting anything in return. Every repaired board seemed to repair a small piece of me. As well, one afternoon, while organizing old materials beneath the porch, I discovered several weathered boxes tucked away in a corner. Inside were dozens of photographs. Margaret joined me as we carefully sorted through them. There were pictures of family vacations, birthday celebrations, church gatherings, and holidays stretching back decades. There were photographs of Thomas teaching their son to ride a bicycle, pictures of young grandchildren playing in the yard, and then there were photos of Margaret herself, young, vibrant, full of dreams. As she looked through them, tears slowly rolled down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness alone, tears of remembrance. Tears for a life beautifully lived. Tears for a love deeply missed. That evening, after I returned home, I couldn't stop thinking about those photographs. I realized something important. People often assume loneliness comes from being alone. But sometimes loneliness comes from feeling forgotten. Margaret wasn't simply missing her husband. She was missing the life she once had, the memories, the shared experiences, the feeling that someone truly saw her. The next weekend, I decided to do something special. I contacted several of her family members whose names appeared on old photographs. Some lived nearby, others lived in different states. Coordinating everything took weeks of planning. Margaret knew nothing about it. When the day finally arrived, I invited her outside under the excuse of showing her the completed porch. The moment she stepped outside, her entire family emerged from cars parked along the street. Children, grandchildren, old friends, relatives she hadn't seen in years. The look on her face was impossible to describe. Shock gave way to disbelief. Disbelief became overwhelming joy, and then came tears. The kind of tears that come from feeling loved beyond words. For hours, laughter filled the neighborhood. Stories were shared. Memories were revisited. Photographs were passed around. The porch that had once been falling apart became the center of one of the happiest days Margaret had experienced in years. As the sun set that evening, she sat quietly beside me. The family gathering continued around us. Children chased each other across the lawn while adults talked beneath strings of lights. Margaret looked at the finished porch and smiled. Then she looked at me. She said she thought I had repaired far more than wood. I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time, but later, as I drove home from work one rainy afternoon, it finally became clear. The porch had never been the real project. The real project was restoring connection, restoring hope, restoring the feeling that none of us are meant to face life alone. Months passed. Autumn arrived. The leaves turned brilliant shades of orange and red. Margaret continued spending evenings on her porch. But now she was rarely alone. Family visited more often. Neighbors stopped by regularly. The community seemed drawn to her renewed spirit. And surprisingly, my own life continued changing too. The loneliness that had consumed me after my divorce slowly faded. I became closer to friends. I reconnected with family. I started living again instead of merely existing. One simple act of helping someone else had transformed both of our lives. If you're enjoying this story so far, here's a special request. Comment below with the words, "Kindness changes lives." If you believe even small acts of compassion can create extraordinary change. A year later, on a beautiful spring afternoon, I received a handwritten letter from Margaret. Inside was a simple note. She thanked me for fixing her porch, but she also thanked me for reminding her that life still had beautiful chapters left to write. I still keep that letter today, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they represent. A reminder that kindness is never wasted. A reminder that helping someone else can heal parts of ourselves we didn't even know were broken. A reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures become the most meaningful moments in another person's life. Margaret passed away peacefully, 3 years later, surrounded by family. At her memorial service, several people shared stories about her generosity, warmth, and unwavering faith. Toward the end, Her granddaughter approached me with tears in her eyes. She told me Margaret often spoke about the porch. Not because it had been repaired, but because it marked the moment she stopped feeling forgotten. I struggled to hold back tears, because in truth, Margaret had given me something far greater than I had ever given her. She taught me that healing doesn't always happen through grand achievements. Sometimes it happens through a hammer, a few boards, a little time, and a willingness to care. And perhaps that's what makes kindness so powerful. It doesn't need wealth. It doesn't require perfection. It simply requires a heart willing to notice when someone else is hurting. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep stories like these alive and spreading hope to people who may need it most. Because somewhere, someone may be carrying a burden you cannot see, and your kindness might be the very thing that changes their life forever.